Answer.
Hello, viewers. Welcome back to the dialogue series of Jindal School of International Affairs. I'm Sreeram Chaulia, Dean of the school. We are located in the National Capital Region of Delhi in India. Um, so this series has been taking you along various regions of the world and also picking up some major themes related to the coronavirus pandemic and how it has been playing out in the last several months. And we've had some many distinguished panelists on this series over the months, and we're very fortunate today to be hosting Professor Anne Mary Slaughter. She's actually a legend in the field of international law and international relations, one of the top scholars in the world. She's taught at Princeton University. She was dean of the Woodrow Wilson School there. She taught at Harvard, and now she heads a major think tank in Washington, D.C., called New America. New America has been at the forefront of ideas for rejuvenation of the US's role in the world and also in terms of domestic governance. So she's actually also straddles the world between academia and policy making, because she was the first woman to be made director of policy planning in the US State Department during the Barack Obama administration. And policy planning is a very important element of US foreign policy structure, because they make forecasts and long-term predictions and plan for decades to come in terms of what should be the US's role. But of course, there's been a lot of volatility and fluctuations in the US's role in the world. And that's one of the things we'd like to discuss with Professor Slaughter today. Welcome, Professor Slaughter. First of all, welcome from India. We are so grateful for your time and attention.
Well, thank you. And I'm very pleased to be able to be part of this. I am a great admirer of the Jindal School, and I taught your founder at Harvard Law School many years ago. So this is a pleasure for me.
Great honor for us indeed. So taking up this menu, when we say international relations in the pandemic era, it seems to me that this era, or at least the third decade that we have just started, seems to be increasingly molded and shaped for better or worse by this terrible calamity that the world has been witnessing. And we thought that perhaps it's a 6 month affair, but the way it's continuing to haunt many of our countries, including the US and India and most other parts of the world, even the ones which had written off the pandemic and said that they have tamed it, are now we are seeing a recrudescence. So it looks to me, Professor Slaughter, that this is here to stay for some time. We have to somehow live with it, but also understand what it's doing. And you've written many works. I still remember as a PhD student reading your New World Order book. And now it seems quite appropriate to talk about another New World Order, because certainly the post-Cold War era is over. I mean, there's no going back to that golden period of US unipolarity and US led liberal order. It seems like they've all crumbled. So now what is coming? I mean, you've always been this big intellectual talking about the big picture. So what do you think this pandemic has done? And frankly, I mean, it is a black swan event, right? People say Bill Gates predicted it and all that, but look at it this way. I mean, none of us in the field in international studies really imagined that there would be such an earth-shaking phenomenon that would come out of a virus from China. I mean, this is completely new, and perhaps you are also an academician. Maybe we missed seeing this. I mean, people missed predicting the collapse of the Soviet Union, but this seems like completely wild and out of the blue. And so, even 6 months down the line, we have not adjusted. So, what do you think is happening, and what is this doing to the world? What kind of world order are we in?
Well, so there's a lot there. I think the first thing to say is that this is a global event and a globally shaping event, like World War I and World War II, and that is really the best analogy in the sense, if you think about World War II, of course, it started in Europe, then it spread to Asia. And by the end of it, pretty much everywhere in the world was affected. People didn't know how long it was going to last. That's very, very important because, as you say, even 3 months ago in March, when everybody in the United States started to lock down, if you had said, you won't be going back to work probably for a year, people would have said, no way, this is 3 months. And that similarly in World War II, people thought, oh, the war will be over by Christmas. When it started, no one understood the full magnitude of it. So that's one thing, that we don't know when it's going to end, but already we can see that the impact is much greater than we imagined. And I think that will continue to be true because the economic impact is just beginning to be felt. The global infections, both the new countries that are now experiencing infections for the first time, and as you say, even a country like China that says they stopped it, they're going to have to continually sort of go through these cycles of at least tightening up, if not shutting down. And of course, the United States is very much in the midst of it. So that's so it is global. It has multiple effects. And like a war, it affects everyone differently, but everyone, and it's changing our habits. So again, in World War II in the United States, the men went to war or to war-related industries. The women went to work. The supply chains changed. The food and the way people got food changed. The way people lived their lives was very different for 4 to 5 years. I don't know how long this will last, but I can tell you already, we're not going to work in the same way again. Even when there's a vaccine, I will probably travel half as much as I used to travel. And I will not be going into my office in the same way. Neither will the people who live near my office. So it's a social event or a social phenomenon, as well as an economic phenomenon, as well as a political and geopolitical phenomenon. So that's the way I think we have to think about it. Just as we look back in the 20th century, we look back, World War I, the Depression, World War II, that shaped the rest of the century. And of course, the Russian Revolution. This similarly will shape the century we're in.
No, that's very well put. You're always so articulate. Indeed, it is. It's a earth spanning and seems to be timeless in many ways in terms of, because the ramifications may outlast even the vaccine and even the health crisis. It's quite obvious. And in fact, that brings us to the question of state responsibility. I mean, in the US, you're about to enter a presidential election, and of course, there's a lot of politicization of this issue. But nonetheless, I mean, for many of us outside and the other parts of the world, it still remains, the question of the accountability, because it originated in China, and then there was a sort of a cover up in the initial weeks and months, and then it went out totally berserk, and then the chain of transmission just became secondary and kept passing. So that issue seems to be now entangled with this new order we are talking about, because on one hand, people say that, like you said, that the Chinese have maybe stamped it out, the virus. But on the other hand is the question of the state responsibility and accountability. And what do you think can happen? I mean, I wrote a piece with Nikkei Asian Review in Japan recently, arguing that it's very hard to hold states accountable for these kinds of things in a legal way. And you're also a law scholar. People have been talking about reparations. People have been saying, China may become more powerful in one sense because it's emerging faster in terms of economic recovery. But on the other hand, the stigma and the question of accountability remains. So how do you think that's going to shape? I mean, and that's now linked with this so-called new Cold War that's been unleashed. So the accountability question, what do you think can be done about it?
Well, and this goes to your earlier question about the way we are watching some kind of new order be born. It's not clear what it's going to be, but it is absolutely clear that the post 1945 world order that we have added on to ever since 1945 is changing before our eyes again, because we've got so many different factors at once. So on the question of accountability, it's very hard. I mean, again, this was predicted, as you said. Many people have been predicting pandemics, and we've seen pandemics. We've seen SARS, we've seen MERS, we saw Ebola, which was very close. And if the thing is that COVID is tricky, it's not so deadly that the whole world stops what it's doing and fights the virus, right? Which is what would have happened with Ebola and what did happen. It affects people differently. It can come back in various ways. I think China should be held accountable in the court of public opinion for suppressing information. Although I have to say that my own government, left in Washington, if we did not have a free press, President Trump was perfectly happy to suppress the numbers of cases. So we have to be careful about pointing the finger. But I do think we need to be transparent about what actually happened, and China is accountable for suppressing information. I don't think it can be held legally accountable under, I mean, you can try, and there's a whole obviously legal set of doctrines on state accountability, but I think more likely is the political accountability, where other countries say, a country that isn't transparent, that doesn't have a free press, that is essentially still authoritarian. They have state capitalism, and they have a much fairly open economy, at least if we compare it, say, to the Soviet Union. But it's a very different model than the Indian model or the Japanese or the Australian or the American or the European model. And, it's Amartya Sen, the great Indian Nobel laureate, who wrote the article that said, in countries with a free press, you don't have a famine because you can figure out what is happening. And the problem with a famine is not lack of food, it's getting the food to the people who need it, and you need information. So I think there should be a kind of reckoning with, wait a minute, this system has great advantages for development, for efficiency, for control. It has great disadvantages from the world, and other countries will have to make up their mind about that. But the other issue here is this is not good for China. Right? China needs a robust global economy to keep advancing, right? By 2049, China wants to be in a high income country. It is not a high income country. It is a low middle income country. And so the economic consequences, particularly for Xi Jinping, by 2025, he wants to be creating high value manufacturing. This is actually not good for China. It's the first time in 30 years that China will not be growing, and growing at very high numbers. So I think we're going to see a lot of turbulence there. And I think we're going to see a lot of countries looking around and saying, we don't want to choose between the United States and China. We want to be able to grow economically and determine our own fortune politically, and we want to be safe when it comes to pandemics and climate change and a lot of threats that are not about great power politics. They're about human flourishing, and they're going to require human cooperation to solve them.
Very much so, very much so. In fact, cooperation, talking of cooperation, I mean, there's a lot of alarm now about the vaccine nationalism, and this new term that's being used for countries trying to, inoculate their own populations if they have an advantage in scientific R&D. and denying it to the rest of the world. There is this movement to make vaccines a global public good and available for everyone. And that seems to be linked to the larger issue of this reversion to narrow nationalism that we are seeing. I mean, Trump is just one example of it. We are seeing around the world, the return of geopolitics, as they're saying, or just the idea of closing borders and zero sum game. My gain is your loss. So that kind of environment, institutions, you've been writing so much about institutions throughout your career. It seems to be a low point, right? I mean, especially international cooperation, multilateralism. So this new order, I mean, is it really disorder? I mean, that's Ian Bremmer's
Yep.
G0. Is that what we are getting at now? I mean, it seems to be increasingly lacking any kind of coordinating mechanism. I mean, the UN exists and there's the G20, but then if you studied so many issue areas where countries used to cooperate densely, and it used to be a lot better. I mean, and even in the Obama period where you were in government, it was a lot better. But now it seems to be just disintegrating. So in the absence of any kind of like a system manager or system administrator now, and if there is this intense clash between China and the US, so what kind? I mean, you've always been a very innovative thinker. I mean, it's not, instead of saying great powers will provide governance, you've always looked at subtler processes going on within states, non-state actors. So now, what do you think can happen? How can we hold up? Can there be stability at all now in the face of weakening institutions?
No, I do think that is the question. And the way I look at the world, there are two competing paradigms, really. There is the 20th century and really the 19th century, 18th century, all the way back to sort of the emergence of the modern state system. You have great power politics, and the United States national security strategy says we're returning to an era of great power competition. Certainly China, Russia thinks that way. Many governments are very happy with that because it's a world they know how to do that. And indeed, when I watch people in the United States talk about a new Cold War with China, I said this on Fareed Zakaria's show on Sunday, that is easy. It's bipartisan because Democrats and Republicans can get behind a Cold War with China, but it's wrong, right? It is absolutely an outdated paradigm of looking at the world. There are states, they are engaged with great power politics, but in the 20th century, our greatest worry was that, one state would go to a war with another and blow up the whole world, particularly after once we got nuclear powers. That is not the greatest threat we face. I don't want to say it's no threat. I certainly believe that you have a conflict between India and China right now that could be very dangerous. You're both nuclear powers. But you ask the ordinary person in the street, and they are not worried about great power war. They are worried about pandemics. And when they're not worried about pandemics, they're worried about climate change and all the security and economic implications. I mean, again, if you look at India and you look at the flooding and you look at the droughts and you look at the rising sea levels, those are the issues. And the food security, access to water, and then the future of work, right? We're facing an era where technology is totally changing how we work. That's the other paradigm. It's what I call global politics rather than international politics. So on the one hand, you have international, interstate, states fighting one another. And the other, you have this global politics. And there, in the interstate world, there's G0. Yes, there's nobody in charge right now. But in global politics, there are lots of people in charge, right? I always point to the Global Alliance for Vaccines and Immunization, which is going to become ever more important. Well, that's not countries. I mean, there are countries involved, but it was the Gates Foundation. It was the World Health Organization. It was non-governmental organizations all over the world. It was pharmaceutical companies. that's the new world order, right? Where you have these hubs that bring together state and global organizations and political authorities. You have mayors, you have governors, so a
Mm,
lot of subnational authorities. It's very messy. But if you've been keeping up with physics, or in general theories of emergence, right, network theory, you'd say, yeah, that's what happens. It's this kind of messy, constantly evolving set of processes, but you can see patterns and you can actually drive change. So what I
mm,
see is it involves you at a university, it involves me at a think tank, it involves people who run businesses and people who run non-governmental organizations. How do we come together and solve global problems? And we need governments. This is not to say, let's let them play over here and we'll do this here. But I think that the politics of this century will be shaped much more by governments and non-governmental actors acting together, as I say, interstate and global politics, than a 19th century vision of great power politics or a 20th century vision.
mm. Yeah, so it's a horizontal or transnational, processes. Now, in fact, that brings me to a topic which is very dear to your heart. Human rights, democracy, equity. I mean, it seems the pandemic has given an opportunity to a lot of governments to crack down on dissent. I mean, we have seen Hong Kong, that was the worst of all, but there are many other parts. We read about, places like Zimbabwe, and across the board, elections are being cancelled or just, postponed. We don't know. In fact, there's even been a bit of a storm in a teacup in the US about the elections possibly being postponed. So it seems the last few years, especially with the rise of this so-called far right populism and all that, the democracy, human rights were really taking a beating, and advocacy for them, again, at least at the level of high politics, has become almost invisible. I mean, nobody really takes up. Maybe the European Union does a bit of it, but they themselves are highly divided on this question. So who is the champion really? I mean, who do you see taking this forward? I mean, presumably, I mean, maybe there will be a change of regime in the US itself this November, we don't know. But uh, even otherwise, I mean, what do you think is the future for human rights and democracy? I mean, this is the big question, right? Tied to the question about the fate of the liberal order, which has been floundering. Is this going to be a secular decline? Because the Freedom House and these kind of, the institutions that rate democracy, they say that since 2006, 2007, that means even long before Trump and populism, there is a general slide and decline in democracy around the world, and a shift towards semi-authoritarian or fully authoritarian forms. So that could actually be worsened by the pandemic, or do you see the pandemic actually bringing the social forces you're talking about fighting back for justice and eventually helping to create a more equitable order?
Yeah. So again, I do think it's a dialectic. And I started my career in 1990. So I started as a law professor at the University of Chicago in 1990. The wall had just come down. The Cold War was ending. Frank Fukuyama wrote about the end of history. Democracy, liberal democracy, was triumphant. The EU created 1992 and became a single market, right? And then Iraq invaded Kuwait, and the United Nations actually worked the way it was supposed to, and we had a coalition of nations, and democracy, liberal democracy, was on the rise. But even by the end of the 1990s, I remember Samuel Huntington wrote a book or an article called The Fourth Wave, and he had shown that liberal democracy surges forward and then retreats, and then surges forward again, each time higher up the beach, but then it retreats. And he was already saying, this is the fourth wave. And we're seeing more. We saw a huge amount of democratization. All these regimes in Latin America that had been military juntas, became democratic. Obviously, the former Soviet Union, all Eastern Europe, parts of Asia. And so some of this is absolutely to be expected. You have a surge forward and then you have a retreat. So that doesn't surprise me. And it's also true that we're in early days. So we saw the Arab Spring. Everybody thought, here comes democracy in the Arab world. It got crushed. But remember, the French Revolution took 50 years before you had anything that looked like a liberal democracy in France. So I do think there's no question we're in retreat. I think it is particularly worrisome with the new technologies we have, right? With facial recognition technology,
Surveillance.
the way China has, that is terrifying in terms of not being able to move, right? It really is like, these futuristic imagining that the big brother can see you wherever you are. But if you look at the United States, and you look actually even before COVID, you had demonstrations in Chile and in Lebanon,
Yeah.
in country and the Philippines, around the world. People are more aware of their power. And what you're seeing in the United States with this movement for racial justice is very much an insistence on basic human rights, civil rights, that we had this in the 60s, and we've gone backwards in some places. So this is people saying, wait a minute, liberal democracy cannot mean that Black people get stopped and beaten by the police many, 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 many more times than white people do. So I think you actually are seeing a dialectic. What is hard, as you say, is who's in charge. But again, the movement for Black lives, just like a lot of the movements in the Arab Spring, there is no one person in charge, right? It's a different kind of leadership, but there is power there. And I think we're going to see it emerging in new forms. And it will be at least constraining state power in various ways.
Yeah, nobody is in charge. Valid point. But I saw you recently on the Farid Zakaria show, and you were saying the US, is a staggering failure with Corona, and that brings me to the, your biggest concern, which is the US's, own role domestically and internationally. It's been a letdown. I mean, to put it mildly. I wrote a recent book called Trump, and the subtitle was "Emerging Powers in a Post-American World." A refrain on Farid's concept of the post-American world. And here, what I was arguing was that the ability of the US to be able to maintain balances of power and order in different regions of the world has declined greatly. And in the absence of, there are so many alternative regional hegemons that could supplant the US's historical role since World War II. So now it seems like, and this I wrote before the Corona pandemic. Now it seems to be, in many ways I've been reified, because what's we see is, with Ebola, at least, Obama was very active. There's no question about it in Africa. And in earlier, crises, even with the swine flu, 2009, I think the US took upon itself, that kind of, that we are bound to lead, as Joseph Nye once said. So that kind of thing is simply that will to lead or shape the world order seems to be totally gone. I mean, even if Trump loses in November, let's say there's a Biden presidency, I don't see that coming back. It seems like the society has lost that, the push outward, and it's more inward. So in that context, you've been, agonizing about, the role of the US. For you, it's so important. So what do you think going forward? I mean, is what the US can do really for itself? I mean, it will remain a great power. It's no longer the sole superpower, and it has a vast military, footprint still around the world. But shaping and influencing institutions, norms, behavior, practices, all that seems to have just fallen apart. So is there some kind of a rejuvenation of that side of the US? You can imagine, in terms of its foreign policy, the values base and all that. I mean, do you see it really making a comeback? Is that also a cyclical thing? waxing and waning like democracy, or you think this is, those times are gone now?
Yeah. So I smile when you said rejuvenation, because I've just submitted a book manuscript under the title Renewal. And renewal is like rejuvenation. It is to make young again, to make new again. I think we are at an extraordinarily low point. As I said on Fareed's show, that I just never dreamed in my lifetime that we would not be able to travel to other countries because of our own incompetence and dysfunction, where we cannot fight a virus that many other countries have managed to subdue. I mean, it's just spectacular incompetence. But I think this has been coming for a while. One of the reasons I turned away from full-time foreign policy and went to run New America in 2013 was my sense that I had no business preaching to the rest of the world when my country's educational system was coming apart, the infrastructure was coming apart, the inequality was growing. I mean, all these things that Americans say we stand for were increasingly hollow at home. And so the need to live up to what we say we are for at home first, before we are out there preaching to the rest of the world and leading in the rest of the world, I think was very necessary. In our own history, we have had these cycles, and they are cycles where if you look at the late 19th century, we had huge inequality, we had violence in the streets, we had labor strikes and the Socialist Party, and then we had massive reform in the first 3 decades of the 20th century. I think we're due for that again. I will also say, and this is very important for the world, we are the first any democracy to go from a majority white country to a plurality country. Obviously, India has many, many, many different groups, but you were created that way. We were created as a majority white country, and American meant white, that until now. So in 2026, we will have our 250th anniversary. By 2045, there will be no majority. That white people will be about 48, 49%. Latinx Americans will be 35%, African Americans, but there will be no majority. That is a dramatic change. And there are many Americans who are very worried, who feel like this isn't the country I know. I think this is a great change. So to go to your question, I think we need to do the work of racial justice and racial equity. We have to live, we are founded on the promise that all men are created equal. And we're not living up to that. But if we can renew ourselves, then I think, and we don't have to wait that long. I think these things happen together, but we need to be in the world, but in a different way. We need to be the people, yes, bringing people to the table, insisting that there be a global response. That shouldn't just be our government. That should be our universities, our foundations, our CEOs. And all of those folks are increasingly global, right? I mean, we have, you look at the number of Indian Americans who are playing a really important role, who are Indian American. They're not Indian, but they have ties to India. And the same is true with other countries. And Fareed Zakaria is a good example. That's a very different kind of leadership. It's not we're in charge. It's what I call leading from the center, because you're connected to so many others, but you're very inclusive, and you're bringing people with you, and you're letting other people lead, right? And there's a big role for smaller countries right now. And it's been interesting to see that Australia has been demanding that China be called to account. Australia has a much better shot at that than the United States does. And I think there'll be a big role for smaller countries as well. So the US is down but not out. I do believe we can renew ourselves. I think we can renew our role in the world, but it's going to be a very different kind of leadership. And the people representing the United States are going to look very different.
No, so you still hold steadfast to the vision of a multicultural, society, and all those
I
values
do.
which seem to have been run into trouble in recent years. So that's yeah, we will all read renewal with hope. In fact, I think more and more, even in India, given our geopolitical problems with China, there is a shift lately, especially this year, since the pandemic began, where people are saying that, whether we like it or not, it's only the US and which will ultimately matter, along with, of course, many other regional players,
Right.
to be able to push back, aggressive Chinese behavior. So the US will matter for us definitely, and we look forward to that. Now, moving on, I want to also take up the issue of the role of women, especially because you have been a great champion of women in academia. Some of your pieces have been read, reread, cited, I think hundreds of thousands of times,
I think
not just thousands of times. And you've always, you made history yourself in the Barack Obama administration, but also otherwise have led major institutions in US universities, where again, the gender gap is quite obvious. Here, of course, it's the same situation. Now, there has been all this, celebration of women leaders in response to the pandemic. And people have been saying Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand, Tsai Ing-wen of Taiwan, Angela Merkel, and I may be missing a few others. They've done really well. And the argument has been that perhaps they are able to take along more players in the society and unite the society, which is needed to fight a pandemic. And of course, some male leaders have also done well, but quite a few haven't. So, what do you make of this whole, the gender dimension now with the pandemic, especially at the leadership, but even ordinary people? I hear so many amazing stories of, women entrepreneurs, corona warriors who've come forward and have done remarkably well in healthcare and in allied services, and are supporting society in a big way. Could you foresee that this new order we are seeing may also help to improve the balance, which has historically always been, for centuries, been skewed against women?
I do. I do think so. I mean, I think it's very tricky because you don't want to say women lead this way and men lead that way. There are many different styles of leadership. I know men who lead in a very collaborative way, a low ego way, and I know women who are extremely assertive and lead in a more traditionally masculine way. I do think overall, because women who come off who are too assertive often just don't get elected because people don't like that from women. So women have learned to lead in a way that is often better at bringing lots of people around the table. I also think when it comes to something like health, people are more willing to accept leadership from women. It's not war, right? It's health. And so when a woman said, if you look at Angela Merkel, she was also a scientist, right? It was more that she was a scientist than a woman, but she just said, look, 70% of the population is going to be infected. She was very no nonsense, very direct, and the German people listened. And Tsai Ing-wen also was really early, right? She understood what needed to happen. But South Korea has also done a really good job, and that was a man. So again, I don't want to say it's all women. I do think that the kinds of issues I've been talking about, the global health, climate change, global violence that is not interwar violence. It's terrorism, but it's also trafficking against people. It's drugs. It's a kind of violence that infects the whole society. Those kinds of issues require collaborative leadership. Again, they require bringing people to the table. It's a very different set of skills. It's hard. It's really hard work, right? I mean, leaving the more traditional male way where you make people do what you want them to do is also hard, but it's different skill sets. It's the difference between a general, right? Who's at the top of the army and says, go do this. And somebody who's at the center of a web, who needs to bring everybody together, more like a social movement. So I do think the way we've been socialized to lead will be particularly in demand. I also think, again, people are more willing to accept that kind of leadership. And that's very important. Because if you think about Indira Gandhi, if you think about Golda Meir, you think about Maggie Thatcher, those were women, but they led like men, because the only way to lead, to be accepted, was to basically be just as tough or tougher than most men. Benazir Bhutto is another example. So I think we're in an era of different kinds of leadership. We'll see men who lead that way too, but they'll look different than the traditional male leaders. And we will see, I think, more women leaders. And it's a good thing.
Yeah, in fact, Justin Trudeau fits the bill, right? A man who has the more feminine side and seems to much more successful than the US. Canada has done a better job at containing the virus, no doubt about it. But that also brings me to the question about order again. I mean, we are now talking about a greater depression. That is the term. Apparently, it is going to be worse, the economic situation, than the 1930s, at least for some time. So the best case scenario I hear from people like Nouriel Roubini is it may not be as long lasting as 10 years like the Great Depression of the 1930s, but it will be for quite some time. And you yourself were talking about, at least 5 years or more for all these things to unspool. So, given the economic depression that we are all facing now, what do you think? I mean, some people fear the worst, that this is first it's going to be a depression, then it's going to be a world war or many regional wars, or fascists will take over many parts of the world. People will ransack stores, and there's going to be hunger widespread. I mean, some of the alarmist scenarios are quite alarming, right? In Latin America, they're saying that the caudillos may come back, in some form or the other, because there is a threat of military takeover to maintain order. So it's quite fragile, right? I mean, especially the economic, even after the virus goes away, it seems like people are going to be suffering for a long time. So what do you think, we all, I mean, especially intellectuals, can do at this stage? I mean, we are advocating for equity and justice, but the question is this some kind of inflection point, not only in terms of world order, but also for economics, the way we've been thinking? Because if the markets clearly, I think you'll agree with me, were the priority rather than public health, and especially the stock markets and big business interests and market sentiment was dominating everything. And that's probably one of the reasons we invested in health, and all of us are now suffering. So what should be the priority, you think, for rebuilding societies and the world when we try to emerge from this economic depression?
Yeah. Well, so I have to start by laughing. So I know Nouriel Roubini, and I like him very much. But the joke is always that he has predicted 10 of the last 5 recessions. Right? He is or depressions. He's a very gloomy man. He did predict 2008, but he's also predicted a number of times where we have not had the crisis to come. But I also think there's a deeper point there, and it goes to your issue about what we can do. So work on optimism and pessimism shows that pessimists are often right? They're right to be pessimistic, but optimists are more successful. And that is because an optimist feels that we have more agency. If I can tell you, I can't be, a dreamer. I can't ignore the very factors that people are predicting, the very many terrible things that are happening. We've had 150,000 people die in the United States. Only 55,000 Americans died in the Vietnam War, although many, many more Vietnamese died. So, people are dying right now, and I can go downtown in my own little town and see the economic damage. I can see the stores that have closed. So you can't sort of pretend that's not happening. But an optimist looks at what good could come and then tries to make that vision happen so that we have energy and can put our energy and our work and our determination and our commitment towards something. And there, I think we are in for a lot of economic damage. But this is, we are also in the transition from the industrial age to the digital age. And that takes decades. And people like me have been writing about a new way of working where people can be at home much more. Again, if you are a mother or a father, or you're a son or a daughter and you're taking care of your own parents, that you needed a way to work that was much more integrated with the rest of your life. And many people want to work in ways that allow them to do a day job and a couple side jobs. People are musicians or painters, or they, volunteer for part of the time. They have much more to them than the person who goes and works 8 hours in a factory or in an office. And that economy is possible, right? We honestly, with the productivity and the lower cost of living. Just take universities. You're in a university. Suddenly, we've been saying forever we could go online and that people could get educated much more cheaply. But nobody wanted to do that because everybody wanted to come to the campus. Well, now suddenly there's going to be the ability for millions, billions of people to learn in ways they couldn't. And at least hundreds of millions of ways for people like you and me to teach, and not just people like you and me who have PhDs, but people who know things. My sons have learned everything from drumming to cooking to fixing the dishwasher on YouTube. So I do think that part of what we need to do is we have to put a lot of safety nets in place. The United States is, we have nothing. We don't have universal health care, but we also have to have a vision of a world in which people maybe only work 6 hours a day paid and 4 hours unpaid. That's all that care work. And then they have the ability to do other things, and that they can live in their communities and not all go to the cities, which is much better for the environment, much better for housing, much better for traffic. So again, I don't want to say that we're not heading for trouble, and we could conceivably have a world war, but we could also articulate a vision of the transition we're making and say, given that we have a crisis, now's the time to move, to get off fossil fuels. Now's the time to shift to renewable energy. Now's the time to put in universal broadband and help people move to knowledge-based work in ways that would be much better for most people.
Yeah, so rightly said. I mean, unthinkable, ways of life. Now, finally, we are executing them. So I think out of crisis, there is an opportunity to change and to transform. Very much so. Last but not least, I'm going to try and tickle your academic, bone. All of us say that when there are big crises, that you remember the 2008 crisis, they said the field of economics ought to be, rethought and rewritten. The basic assumptions, Homo economicus, rational man, all those things turned the world into, a miserable place. And now again, we are seemingly at an inflection point due to the coronavirus. Um, you think academia ought to, at least at the level of syllabi, when we teach people, we just have this received wisdom, right? The theories and the hypotheses that have been written, 50, 40, 30 years ago. And now in this new era, it seems some of these seem totally outdated. Like you were saying, the nationalism and nationalistic rivalry, it seems is more like a 19th century thing, but it's made a comeback. But now, likewise, is there a basis for us to reevaluate our epistemologies, and how should we go forward? I mean, there is there is this big void right now, it seems, because we could not foresee this at all. And all of us, I mean, maybe except the epidemiologists and some public health people and visionaries, most of us could not see this coming. So this is a big slap in the face for, the academia as it has been structured, because we tend to be somehow very smug that we know stuff and we are social scientists and we can predict, but we are failing. And so in that sense, can there be a renewal of academia, and if so, on what values or what principles you think? I mean, we need to, I think, unlearn a lot of stuff.
Yeah. Well, I will say on economics for sure. Let's start with that. It's easier. It's not my discipline, so I can always pound on another discipline. But there already have been, even before the virus, lots of calls for teaching economics differently, studying economics differently, the new economic thinking. And Hilary Cottam, who's a designer in Britain, and I have written something about sapiens integra. So instead of homo economicus, that, all rational, self-interested man, which we know is a myth, why not think about whole human beings, right? People who do want things for themselves, who calculate and advance their interests. That is definitely a part of human nature. But another part of human nature are people who want to belong, right? Who want to invest in others, who want to care for others. And you can say that's masculine and feminine, or you can just say those are two halves of the beings we have evolved to be, and our models take account of only one side. So just as one example, I do think our models need a lot of work, but I think we probably need more, well, we will get more radical change than that, because again, young people get their knowledge from many different places. I see many students who go to university to get the credential, but get their learning somewhere else, right? And even my own children, again, one's in college, one graduated from college, but they're not drawing on their college classes. They're drawing on what they can pull down from the internet. Now that is actually dangerous in some ways, right? There's a lot of stuff on the internet that is not certified, that is really needs to be tested. But I think academia or academics, we're going to become more guides and curators of knowledge that is continually changing, and that we will be teaching our students. And I borrow this from Michael Crow, who's the president of Arizona State University, which is very, very innovative. He says we're teaching people to be master learners. We're teaching them how to assemble knowledge for themselves in lots of ways. Now, we still do need disciplinary ways of thinking. I'm trained as a lawyer, and that's very useful because I know how to think about making arguments and analyzing arguments. And it's not just random stuff. You can't just read a case. You really need to learn how to be a lawyer. You need to think about politics systematically. But I think as you put it, this received canon, our syllabi that, you have to read this, and once you've read this, I think that's going to become much more fluid and much more, we're going to constantly interrogate what we think we know in ways that invite many more voices in, many, not just people who have PhDs, and that is constantly testing that knowledge exactly against actual, what are the predictions, what is the practice. So we're in for a lot of change. That much I think I'm confident in saying.
Well, that's really, I mean, you always put your finger on futuristic developments, and I'm sure we'll think about this, because some of the rigid, barriers and lines that we have drawn, like you say, fluidity may be the way forward, because otherwise we are not able to solve, the real world problems that seem to be emerging and getting worse and worse. I mean, just imagine 2008 was a great recession, and now they're saying it's a depression. I mean, in 10 years, hardly the world is head spinning, right? The kind of crises that seem to be piling up one after the other, and we're just not getting any respite. And so the universities, the academy, I hope, will also think about reform at a very deep level,
Yeah,
of
I think
course,
so.
teaching and research both. Um, we are open to questions, and audience, please type anything you'd like. We have a few minutes left with Anne-Marie Slaughter, but maybe I'll initiate a question anyway, and we'll wait for the audience. A shorter one. What do you think is going to happen now with the the U.S. election? Because it seems quite obvious that Trump is trailing, and many people have already written him off. But then the polls were wrong last time too. So there's this whole uncertainty factor about the U.S. election. And likewise, I mean, more broadly, if you can think about, I mean, in terms of politics, they said that globalism was losing and nationalism was winning, right? At least for some time. But as that burnt out now, and are we now at a stage where some form of globalism or liberal may make a comeback? I mean, you cannot rule it out, like we said before. So US and the rest of the world, I mean, is there a current and now a counter current now emerging as a result of the colossal failure of some of these populists with managing the pandemic?
Yeah,
Bolsonaro is terrible in Brazil, and Johnson has also messed up
terrible.
in the UK, and so quite a few of them have done miserably. So you think there could actually be, I wrote a piece recently saying history will judge them harshly,
Yep.
but will voters judge them harshly? Are they going to be booted out, you think? And if so, is this populism going away now? Are we in a new direction?
So I don't think populism is going away, mostly again because we're in a period of such great technological change. In other words, jobs are changing. Many of the factors that lead populists to gain support are blaming other people, blaming immigrants, and that, if you notice, immigration is being suppressed because of the virus. Everybody is saying they're closing their borders, but that's not gone away. I think that's still just kind of in abeyance for the time being. I do think, though, an argument for science is very strong, right? I mean, the countries that paid attention to what the public health people and the medical people told them have done much better. Certainly in the United States, yes, the biggest reason Trump is losing support is people are dying. And he's out there refusing to wear a mask and telling people it will all go away. And his base may be committed to him, but the folks who were not his base, and again, only 28% of Americans are Republicans, 29% are Democrats. Everybody else is an independent. So there's a big movement, a lot of room in there. The thing is that no one wants to be complacent, right? And people are so worried, Democrats anyway, that last time around people thought there's no way he can win. This is ridiculous. Hillary will win. And of course we were surprised. So no one wants to say, yep, this is fine. And I do think you are also in the midst of a generational transition, which different countries are making at different rates. Many countries still have baby boomer, leaders, and it's a striking Biden versus Trump. We'll see next week who Biden's vice president is, but I certainly hope it's somebody younger because that's also what's happening, is that our young people are looking at politics and saying, I don't see anything that looks like myself. I don't see people, who care about what I care about. So that too, I'm just not comfortable making a prediction yet. I would say that anybody who is fighting populism should be fighting with money and time and energy and writing, and because there are no guarantees here.
We're almost out of time. Lots of reflections on a variety of themes. Anne-Marie Slaughter is a big public intellectual, so I thought I'll, spread out and quiz her on a variety of things. But the audience, there are a few questions about the UN and international organizations. I think we had covered the institutions, and I think Professor Slaughter was saying that one must look at it more from a bottom up perspective. But of course, intergovernmental processes also continue. There is also some questions about technology and tech, whether it is, there's a tech war right now going on between China and the US, but also more broadly, I think Professor Slaughter has answered some of them about the nature of work and how it is transforming now. I think capitalism, or whatever we want to call it, itself is likely to transform. The big structures. I'm afraid we have very less time, but the last word from you on this new order. It's like a curate's egg, like you mentioned. There are positives and negatives in there, but I think we all want to survive, right? Because the pandemic has really brought home how important it is just for us to breathe and to live. And I think that is now hopefully going to be the basis. Human life, we are all in academia, we think in terms of big structures, power and influence and all that, but it's now really come down to just human beings being able to breathe and to survive.
So I'll give everybody a final image for how I think about the world order. So the 20th century world order, imagine a globe, and then think about New York or Geneva or Rome or Nairobi, the places you had these big UN agencies, and imagine, the skyscrapers sticking out from the globe. We all sometimes see pictures like that. Here's New York, and I think about a world in which we flatten those organizations. So instead of you're sitting on top of the UN building in New York, trying to convene the Security Council to order somebody to do something, instead you flatten them and they become the hubs of a lot of global activity by non-state actors. So that they still have a role, but not in the way they were originally designed. They should be, as I said, the hubs of universities, businesses, civic groups, mayors, governors, legislators, all the people you need to solve problems. But you still have legitimacy because they are state-based and they were adopted, and states are, how we're still organized. But they need to think of their role, again, instead of those buildings sticking out, flatten it out and imagine the world like the internet with some very big hubs and then some smaller hubs that allow people to be connected and to actually solve problems together. And I would leave you with that image.
A democratic world order, hopefully, more democratic one, definitely one where power is more diffused, and one, of course, where we would want more from Anne-Marie Slaughter in terms of ideas. She has always been at the cutting edge and really privileged. Thank you so much, Professor Slaughter. Thank you for your time. Thank you to the audience. Signing off, but until next time.
It was my pleasure. Thank you.